How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem, Daf 40 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 40 is great. It's a small little daf, though it is pretty interesting. It's small, but it's not easy per se. I wouldn't say it's too difficult either. There are some interesting nuggets there. It's a small daf with, I don't know how to say, it's a small daf with great Gemara on it. How's that? Anyways, so we discuss slaughtering for the mountains. If one slaughters for the mountains or for the river or for the sea or whatever, that he has in mind for the mountains to be a deity of sorts. Anyways, what happens? And then we'll discuss slaughtering your friend's animal for avodah zarah. First of all, I will just say it's not a very nice thing to do. But if one did it, what happens? Friends, that's what we have on our plate for today on Daf Mem of Masechta Chullin. Come join me. Let's have a great time learning Daf Mem of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin. Daf Lamed Tes Amid Beis, all the way at the bottom, at the Mishnah. Hashoichet l'shem harim. So somebody who slaughters for the mountains, l'shem gvos for the hills, l'shem yomim for the seas, l'shem neharos for the rivers, l'shem midbaros for the deserts. Rashi says l'shem yomim she'asa hayom avodas kechavim. He decided that the sea was going to be an avodah zarah, and he's slaughtering animals for the sea. Psula, so the animal is possible. The shchita is possible. Okay, azoy. Continues the Mishnah. We're now on Mem Aleph Amid Aleph. Shnayim ochzim besakin. If you have two people holding on to the shchita knife, one on either end, meshaychatin, and they slice together in, what's that called when you, in I don't know, in rhythm, in there, they worked it out how to slice together. Echad l'shem echad mikol elu. One of them was having in mind one of the kavanas that we just mentioned for the mountains, for the hills, etc. Ve'echad l'shem davar kosher, and the other one was thinking, I'm hungry, I want lunch. Shchitasei psula. So in that case, the shchita is possible since one of the shaychtim was thinking about the mountains and the hills. Says the Gemara, psula in zivche mesim lo. Oh, so fact the Gemara 1 second. This is a little peculiar. You have a fellow, he's shechting an animal for the mountains, for the hills, for the rivers. These are deities as far as he's concerned. This is avodah zarah. Why is this not the sacrifices of the dead? After all, we have a brayse that says Ashaychi l'shum harim, l'shum gvos, l'shum yomim, l'shum naharos, l'shum midbaros. Somebody who slaughters for any of the aforementioned reasons, l'shum chama, l'shum levana, l'shum kochavim, mazalis, l'shum michal sar agadol, l'shum shilshul ka'in. Whether it's for the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations, the great minister, the great ministering angel of Michael, for the smallest little bug. If you make these into deities, if these are deities, they are the offerings of the dead. They have the sacrifices of the dead, and they're asur ba'ano. So on the one hand, our Mishnah is saying that if you sacrifice to the mountains and the hills, etc., the shchita is possible. Nish geferlich. But we have a brayse that says that apparently in the same scenario, it's the sacrifices of the dead. It's zivche mesim. That's a totally different league. And for the Gemara, Amr Abaye says Abaye, Lokasha nish geferlich, no problem. Hada Amr lehar, hada Amr ligada dehar. Abaye says, well, it depends what his kavana was. If his kavana was for the mountain itself, well, then the animal is merely pasul. Then the animal is merely pasul. It's not zivche mesim. If it's for the angel of the mountain, if it's for the ministering angel of the mountain, the deity, right, the heavenly minister of the mountain, well then that's what the brayse is talking about when it's zivche mesim. We can also infer it because in the brayse, what else is on that list? Dumya de Michal Sar Gadol. Michal Sar Gadol is on the list. The great ministering angel Michael. So just like the great ministering angel Michael refers to the angel Michael, so also when we're talking about the mountains and the hills and the rivers, etc., we aren't talking about the actual mountains and hills. We're talking about their ministering angel, Shmamina. So there you have it. Now, there's a very interesting question about why. What's the difference between sacrificing for the mountains versus sacrificing for the angel of the mountain? So Rashi says that because, so of course there's a Gemara, there's a pasuk, right? There's a pasuk in Chumash. It says, "Abed ta'abdun es kol ha'mekomos asher avdu sham ha'goyim asher atem yorshim osim es Elohim ala harim aramim v'aladvos v'sachas es koran." And this is a pasuk that we learned about in Masechta Avodah Zarah, that you have to destroy all of the Avodah Zarah. Where am I? Ala harim aramim. Right, es Elohim ala harim aramim. So Elohim ala harim v'lo harim Elohim. Do you remember that? Limud? That their gods are on the mountains, but the mountains themselves are not their gods. The idols that are on the mountains or whatever might be there on the mountain, so that could be avodah zarah. But the mountain itself is not going to be avodah zarah. So therefore, if a person is sacrificing an animal for the mountain itself, well, the mountain itself isn't technically avodah zarah. It's part of the earth, part of the ground. It's not technically avodah zarah. But for the angel, that's not part of the earth. That's not part of the ground. It's not heharim Elohim. Because what does Rashi say? Dilo mechuberu. It's not the angel of the mountain is not connected to the ground, and therefore, if you sacrifice to the angel of the mountain, so then it will be zivchei mesim. Now, givaldik. Now, Tosfos asked an interesting question, though. What did Rashi say? Wait, so I'm not done with Rashi yet. So Rashi had said that if you sacrifice the mountain itself, so then, since the mountain itself is not going to be a deity, is not an avodah zarah, the mountain itself is not avodah zarah, therefore, the animal is not zivchei mesim. But it is nonetheless possible because it's similar to sacrificing for avodah zarah, and therefore it is nonetheless going to be possible. Okay, fine. What does that say? Miu elos. Okay, fine. No, not that. Okay, fine. Okay, seder. Oh, that was something else. Okay, because it's similar to shechting for avodah zarah. Okay. So according to Rashi, so when you sacrifice for the mountain itself is not a deity, therefore it's not zivchas mesim, but because it's similar to sacrificing for a deity for avodah zarah, so therefore it's nonetheless possible. Tosfos asks a very, very interesting question. He gives two answers. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, I think actually Taka Sanhedrin. Anyways, it was Taka and Tosfos yesterday, right? And Sanhedrin says that nonetheless, if you bow down to the mountain, you will nonetheless be chayav misa. Right? One who bows down to a mountain, right? One who bows down to a mountain, so he is chayav. Right? So the mountain itself is not going to be avodah zarah, but a ovdo beside somebody who does bow down to a mountain, he is chayav misa, and therefore in this case as well, he will nonetheless be chayav misa for sacrificing for the mountain. The thing is, if we're saying, Rashi said the mountain itself is not actually avodah zarah, which is why the animal is not zivchei mesim. But if the mountain itself is not avodah zarah, why is he chayav misa for slaughtering an animal for the mountain if it's not actually avodah zarah? That's Tosfos kasha. Tosfos gives two answers, both very interesting. The first answer is that actually, you know what? The mountain actually is avodah zarah. The mountain actually is avodah zarah. Therefore, if you make the mountain avodah zarah, it actually is avodah zarah. Well, then what is it? What about the limud that we learned about in Masechta Avodah Zarah? That ale ha'arim Elohim v'lo ha'arim Elohim. That mountains are not deities. They're not avodah zarah. What do you mean? That's only the gabe to destroy them. Right? What does the pasuk say? Right? The pasuk that says, as Elohim ala harim, from which we make that drasha, it starts off by saying, Abed ta'abdun es kol ha'mekomos. That pasuk is talking about which avodah zarahs do you have to destroy, and which avodah zarahs don't you have to destroy. So you don't have to destroy the mountain. If the mountain is avodah zarah, you don't have to destroy it, but it is nonetheless avodah zarah, and that's why if you serve the mountain, you're going to be chayav you can be chayiv misa for serving, for doing avodah zarah, because the mountain itself is avodah zarah. You just don't need to destroy the mountain. So then it gets back to the question of, well, if it is avodah zarah, well then shouldn't slaughtering an animal for the mountain be zivchei mesim, the sacrifices of the dead? Why then does the Gemara say that if it's for the mountain itself, it's only possible? The answer to that, Tosfos says, it's because just like the vessels, if you have vessels that are used to serve the mountain, those vessels would not be osur, and therefore the same applies to the animals that are used to serve the mountain. They're also, just like the vessels are not osur, so the animals are not osur, but they're not zivchei mesim, but they are nonetheless possible. So very interesting. So Tosfos disagrees with Rashi. Rashi says that the mountain itself is not avodah zarah, and that's why the animal is not zivchei mesim. But then what about the fact that a person who sacrifices for the mountain is chayiv misa? How come? So Tosfos says the mountain itself is actually avodah zarah. A different answer of Tosfos is that no, actually the mountain isn't avodah zarah. Fine, the mountain is not avodah zarah. Well, if the mountain is not avodah zarah, so then how come you'd be chayiv misa for sacrificing for it? Well, just like the kochavim and mazalos, right, as we said in the Brisa, if one sacrifices for the kochavim and mazalos, it's zivchei mesim. Now the kochavim and mazalos, the stars and the sun and the constellation, they're not avodah zarah, but nonetheless, if you bow down to them, you are going to be chayiv for that. So just like you're chayiv for bowing down to the constellations and things like that, so also if you bow down to the mountain and you treat it as a deity, you will also be chayiv for that, similar to the constellation. So very interesting, Tosfos over there getting into the details about what exactly is how do we understand this concept of the mountain not being avodah zarah. Alrighty, and now we get up to the next section of today's daf, slaughtering your friend's animal for avodah zarah. Interesting Gemara. By the way, my apologies if you hear like thudding in the background. There's like serious underground pounding going on. There's been work going on for months and months and months. So my apologies. All right. Says the Gemara, says Ravuna, Oisa be'emas chavero revutza lifnei avodas kochavim. If your friend's animal was lying down before an avodah zarah, once you've sliced through one of the simanim, asra, the animal is now asur. Once you've sliced through one of the simanim, the animal is now asur. Now, as we're going to learn out tomorrow, generally we say, Ein Adam Oser. Right, Ein Adam Oser davar she'eino shelo. Even though a person can't make Oser that which he does not own, but that which doesn't belong to him. However, once he does a maisa, like slicing through one of its simanim, well then, that changes things, and it will be asur. Sarva lakiyada amar Ula, and Rav Huna holds like Ula says, Amr Rav Yochanan, the name of Rav Yochanan, afal pisha amru, even though they said a mishtachave libeh mas chavero lo asur, even though they said that one who bows down to his friend's animal, if one bows down to his friend's animal, as those in avodah zarah, he does not make that animal asur whatsoever. You can even offer it as a korban. Also, b'maisa, but if you make a maisa for avodah zarah, asur, it becomes asur. So says Rav Huna. So Rav Huna says based on right, kihada amrula, it's similar to Azula said. So Rav Huna says that if you see your friend's animal lying down before avodah zarah and you slice its neck, once you get through the trachea, it is already asur. And that is like Ula says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that even though one who bows down to his friend's animal does not make it asur whatsoever, nonetheless, if he does a maiseh, and in our case we're talking about slicing his throat open, so then it will be asur. Okay. Eisvei Rav Nachman the Rav Huna. Rav Nachman, however, asks a very interesting question to Rav Huna, and that is, Hashoichet chatos, somebody who shechs a korban chatos. Now the thing is, it's Shabbos, right? B'Shabbos, b'chutz, l'avodas kochavim. You hear this? it just gets more, it's just deeper and deeper. He shechs a korban chatas. Now this is all by accident, correct? Because we're saying that because he did this, he's now going to have to bring more korban chatases. He slaughters a korban chatas. Now it's Shabbos, so because he accidentally slaughtered on Shabbos, he's got to bring another korban chatas for that, and it's outside of the azar, shchutei chutz. So he's got to bring another korban chatas for that, and for avodah zarah, noch a korban chatas. So it says the Brisa, chayiv shalosh chatos, he has to bring three additional korban chatases, because he accidentally slaughtered a korban chatas on Shabbos outside of the azara for avodah zarah. Now the question is, v'omar v'omar kevan sheshachat ba siman echad asra. But if you say that once, if you said that once you slice through one siman, it's already asur. Who wants to explain that to us? I'll tap a slurp of water, and if nobody else wants to explain it, I will. So the Brisa says, somebody shechs his korban chatas on Shabbos outside of the zarah for avodah zarah. She's chayiv 3 korban chatases. Here's the thing. If what Rav Huna is saying is correct, that once you slice through even just one of the simanim, so legabe avodah zarah, it's already also for avodah zarah. The thing is, you're not yet chayiv on shchutei chutz until you complete the shchita, until you slice through both of the simanim. Which means that once you slice through one of the simanim, according to Rav Huna, it's already avodah zarah, and if it's avodah zarah, it's no longer a korban. If it's no longer a korban, so you're not going to be chayiv for shchutei chutz. It's no longer a korban. So the question is, so let's read that again. V'amart, if Rav Huna, what you're saying is correct, kevan sheshachad ba siman echad, that once already you slice through one of the simanim, asra, it's already avodah zarah. So if it's already avodah zarah, it's no longer shaykh to being a korban. Shchutei chutz, well then for shchutei chutz, which you're only going to be chayiv for once you slice through both of the simanim, lo li chayiv, you shouldn't be chayiv for that one. Mechatech ba'afaru, it's no different than just cutting through dirt. Once already this animal's avodah zarah, it's nothing anymore. It can't be used obviously as a korban anymore. So if the Brisa is saying that in this scenario you're chayiv 3 chatases, one for slaughtering on Shabbos, one for slaughtering for avodah zarah, and one for shchutei chutz, I don't understand how you'd be chayiv for shchutei chutz, because once you slice through one of the simanim, it's already avodah zarah, which basically ruins the ability to complete the shchita for shchutei chutz. Amr Rav Papa, says Rav Papa, ocha b'chatas ha'of askinon. Well, says Rav Papa, here, when we say korban chatas, what kind of korban chatas are we talking about? Not a chatas behema, where you have to slice through both simanim, but rather chatas ha'of, a bird korban chatas, where you only do malika and you stick your fingernail through only one of the simanim. Now, the Mishnah in Masechta Zvachim says that when it comes to shchutei chutz, however, you're chayiv, when it comes to birds, shchutei chutz, you're potter for malika, but you're chayiv for shchita, bachutz. So therefore, we're talking about a scenario where it's a bird chatas, and for shchutei chutz, for a bird chatas, once you slice through one of the simanim, so then that would be shchutei chutz, right? Because a bird chatas, you only need to sever one of the simanim, right? You only sever one of the simanim. And when it comes to shchutei chutz for a bird, it's dafka shchita, it's with a knife. So if you have this chatas of and it's Shabbos, so once you slice through one of the simanim, you're mechal Shabbos, you are oved avodah zarah, because Rav Huna says once you slice through one of the simanim, it's already aser, and it's shchutei chutz, because once you slice through one of the simanim, that's how you offer the korban. So again, Amar Papa says, Papa, hacha b'chatas ha'of askinon. Here we're talking about chatas ha'of dechulu b'adei adadei ka'aseh, that everything happens all at once. That when you slice through that first siman, chilul Shabbos, shchutei chutz, avodah zarah. Now the Gemara asks a very interesting question. There's going to be a lot of interesting questions, essentially, for the rest of the daf. Very, 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 very subtle questions. Very, very subtle questions. Which is why I said it's a small daf, but it's a very great daf. There's like all these subtle things on it. So, Michte Rav Huna, Kiman, Amra, Lishmaite, Ke'ula, Ve'ula, Maise Koldu, Ka'amar. Rav Huna had said that if your friend's animal is lying down next to avodah zarah, once you slice through one of the simanim, you make your friend's animal usher. And he said that that's like Ula says. What did Ula say? Well, it wasn't super clear what Ula says exactly, right? Rav Huna was clear that we're talking about you slice through one siman, it's usher. Ula, however, said he's less specific. He says also, right? So Avu Bisha Amra Amishach v'Lemas Chaver Lo Asra. Also, b'Maise Asra. You do a Maise, right? So if you do a Maise of avodah zarah to your friend's animal, it becomes Asra. But he doesn't say exactly how much of a Maise you have to do. A full shchita, a tiny bit of shchita, half a shchita. What do you have to do? Well, from the fact that Rav Huna says you only need to slice through one of the simanim, and he's saying that that's what Ula says. So clearly Ula, when he says that when you do a maise it becomes aser, it's clearly he's not talking about a whole shchita. Because Rav Huna is not talking about a whole shchita, he's talking about one siman. And he's saying that Ula agrees, that that's like Ula. So clearly Ula is not talking about a full shchita either. Well, if he's not talking about a full shchita, well then even a partial shchita will do. And if even a partial shchita will do, according to Ula, right? He says, Kevin asa maise. See, Rav Huna said specifically one of the simanim. Ula never said one of the simanim. He said once you do a maise. And clearly from the fact that Rav Huna, who says just one of the simanim, is like Ula, clearly Ula, his maise is not an entire shchita, clearly, because then that Rav Huna can't hold like him. So that means that when Ula says, once he does a maise, it's enough, it's not a whole shchita, so then it must be this maisa. It could just be any maisa, even the smallest amount of shchita. It would, according to Ula, it wouldn't even have to be one of the simanim, just any amount of a maisa. Any amount of shchita would be enough to make the animal aser. Which means that Rav Huna, who's saying that I'm saying like Ula, so according to Rav Huna, when he says one siman, it doesn't really need to be a whole siman, because if it's based on Ula, it's really just any maisa, any amount, even less than one of the simanim, even half of a siman would be enough for the animal to be aser. Now, if that's the case, well, then we're back to our question. Because if that's the case, that once you slice through even a little bit of a siman, it's aser for avodah zarah, well, then it's no longer shaykh to be a korban. Which means that this chata sa'of, once you slice through a little bit of the siman, you're already chayiv for Chilul Shabbos, you're already chayiv for avodah zarah, but you're not yet chayiv for shchutei chutz. That's going to require the full siman, but by the time you get to the full siman, it's already avodah zarah, which means it's not chayiv to shchutei chutz. So back to our question of why would you be chayiv 3 korban chatases? I would think you shouldn't be chayiv so far, based on what we know now. You shouldn't be chayiv for shchutei chutz. Let's read it again. Says the Gemara in the third line of the Gemara, Mirdei, Rav Huna Kaman Amra Lishmaite. Who does Rav Huna, when he says that once you slice through one of the simanim of your friend's animal, it's already avodah zarah, it's already aser? Who does he hold like? Ki Ula. He's saying he holds like Ula. What does Ula say? Ula says once he does a maisa. But Ula maisa called to Ukamar. But Ula is be'etzim saying, can't be talking about a whole shchita, because Rav Huna is not talking about a whole shchita, and he's saying like Ula. So Ula's then saying, Maisa koldu, any maisa, even the smallest amount of a maisa already makes the bird, the chatas of in our case, aser as avodah zarah. Well, then he shouldn't be chayiv then for shchutei chutz, because at that point it's no longer able to be a korban. So ela be'omer b'gmai zvicha hu ovda. So rather, okay, here's what's going on. It's talking about a scenario where the one who is sacrificing, who is shechting the chatas by accident on Shabbos, outside of the Azara, for avodah zarah, etc. He says, Bigmar zvicha ovda. He says that I'm only doing avodah zarah, I'm only worshipping avodah zarah at the end of the zvicha, at the end of the shechita. He makes it clear. The brisa, which is talking about a person who shechs the korban chatas on Shabbos outside of the zarah for avodah zarah, he says that I only want it to be considered like I'm doing the avodah zarah over here, even though it's by accident somehow, at the end of the shechita. I only want it to be considered like I'm doing the avodah. He's only doing the avodah at the completion of the shechita, which means that, okay, well, if he says specifically, it's not, this is talking about a scenario where he made clear that it's not going to be considered avodah zarah until the completion of the shechita. And when he completes the shechita, so he is Michal Shabbos, he is Oved Avodah Zarah, he is Shchutei Chutz. So the Bryce is talking about where he specified that it shouldn't be considered an avodah until the end of the shechita. Now the Gemara asks another interesting question after I take a slurp of water. The Gemara asks a very, very interesting question, particularly based on the way that Rashi explains it. So, if that's the case, well, if that's the case, that we're talking about a scenario where he specifically says, I'm only doing this avodah, it should only be considered like I'm doing this avodah for avodah zarah at the end of the shechita. Well, if that's the case, then why does the Brisa need to specify that it's a korban chatas? Why does the Brisa need to specify that it's a korban chatas in that case? It could be any it could be any korban. It could be any korban. It could even be a korban shlomim. Because if he's saying, he's overriding any other thing that we would have thought, and he's saying only at the end of the shechita is it going to be considered like I'm doing any avodah. Well, then at that point, it doesn't have to be a korban chatas. What does that mean? So Rashi Taka he writes a lot. He writes a lot on this sugya over here. He gives two explanations, and he Taka prefers the more complicated one. It's a beautiful explanation, but it takes a little bit of explaining. What it means is, very, very interestingly, it's a very beautiful explanation, and here it is. Rav Huna and Ula are talking about what scenario? Where you're shechting and slaughtering for avodah zarah an animal that isn't yours. It's your friend's. You're slaughtering your friend's animal. Now, what's the example in that the Brisa gives? It says a chatas. Why does it have to be a chatas? Why can't it be a shlomim? It's a chatas because a chatas, in a certain sense, is not yours. A shlomim is yours. You offer a korban shlomim. Some of it goes in the mizbeach, some of it goes to the kohen. The rest goes to the owner. It's yours. Therefore, I can understand why even after you slaughter just a little bit for avodah zarah, it could already be considered like you're being avodah zarah, right? It's less, right? The big chiddush with Rav Huna and Ula is that you can even make somebody else's animal usher, right? Normally we would say, Einam, right? Ein adam osed over shenu shelo. Normally we would say a person can't make usher something that isn't his. But over here we're saying that by shechting your friend's animal it becomes usher. It's a chiddush that you're shechting somebody else's animal and making. It's also, even though it belongs to somebody else. But if it's yours, if it belongs to you, it's less of a chiddush, and I can understand why even when you slaughter a little bit of the animal, it already becomes like you're being oved avodah zarah. Now, it's a little bit more of a chiddush, though, to say that even when it comes to somebody else's animal, and you're making somebody else's animal usher, even by slicing a little bit already, it becomes usher. I may have thought that since it's somebody else's animal, maybe I should have to do a meiser rab. I should have to do a significant meiser. I should have to, it's only also once I shech through the whole thing. No, even by somebody else's animal, once you slice through a little bit, it's already also. Now, what's the example that the Brisa gives? The Brisa gives the example of a korban chatas. By a korban chatas, it's similar to the scenarios of Rav Huna and Ula where you're slaughtering somebody else's animal, because a korban chatas, part of it goes on the mizbeach, part of it goes to the kohanim. The person bringing it doesn't get any of it. So it's ki'ilu he's slaughtering somebody else's animal, which is why specifically the Brisa brings the example of a korban chatas. Because unlike a shlamim which you get and it's ki'ilu it's yours, a korban chatas is more similar to the scenario where it belongs to somebody else, it belongs to the kohanim. And the chiddush is, so we're saying, the whole question is that Ula and Rav Huna, if you're saying that when it comes to somebody else's animal, once you slice through a little bit, it's already considered usher. Well, then by the korban chatas, which is also ki'ilu, it's somebody else's animal, the kohen's animal. And if you're going to say that once you slice through a little bit, it's already usher. Well, then what about this brisa, which says you also have to worry about shchutei chutz, and it gets into a question. Now, if you're going to say, though, that, it's talking about where he said that it's only going to be considered an avodah at the end of the shechita. Well, if already he's saying it's at the end of the shechita, then what do I need? Kilu, what's the chiddush of saying that it's a davka korban chatas, and that it's like it belongs to somebody else? At the end of the day, if he's only worshiping it at the end of the shechita, anyways, there's kind of no chiddush. There's nothing specific about the korban chatas anymore. He could have just said a korban shlamim. The whole analogy, the whole similarity by using a korban chatas to it being somebody else's and having that being a consistent, like that we were treated the same way, kind of gets lost if we're saying that anyways you have to wait till the end of the shechita. Well, then it could just be any animal. So Yachi, my area chatas, then what's unique about the korban chatas? The shme'in and zevach, you can even say any other korban, you can even say like a korban shlamim. So Elo Omer Marzutra says, Marzutra Mishmei, to Rab Popit, Hochav Ma'askin, and here what are we talking about? Kigon, Shoyachetzi Kone Pogum. Well, I'll tell you what's going on. It's talking about a situation where, yes, we're talking about a davka, a chata sa'of, where you only need to slice through one of the simanim. And it's talking about a scenario where that siman that you're going to slice through is already halfway broken, which means all you have to do is the slightest little amount in order to make it, fully shechted. And that's the scenario in the Brisa. So it's Shabbos, and you have this chata sa'of, and one of its simanim is already halfway broken through, and you just have to kind of get it over the 50% mark, and you just slice through a tiny amount, and you're mechal Shabbos, and you're ovid avodah zarah, and you're also going to be chayav for shchutei chutz since you cut through a rove of the siman. V'osef alav kolshu, you add a shtickle, v'gamur, and you complete the shchita, dechulu b'adei adadi kasan. In that case, all of them are happening all at once, and we are davka talking about a chatas ha'of, and that is similar to the scenarios of slaughtering somebody else's animal. And it says the Gemara, Amar Papa says, our Papa, Ilav de Omar Rav Huna Simon Echod Lo Havya Chatos Tiyuvte. My Maise Rabba. Says the Gemara, also kind of technical, we're almost done over here. We're going to make these like two kind of like diukim, and then we're done over here. So the first diuk is that, Rav Huna Adavka pointed out that he's slicing through one of these simanim. Right? Amar Papa Yilavda Amar Rav Huna Siman Echad. So Rav Huna specifically said that if you go to your friend's animal and it's before avodah zarah and in front of avodah zarah and you slice through even one of the simanim, it's already aser. It was that nekuda which we asked the whole question about, right? We said, if you're only already chayiv for one of the simanim, well then, how do we deal with shchutei chutz? Because once you slice through one of the simanim, it's already avodah zarah. In this brisa, we're saying you're also chayav for shchutei chutz, but that's only going to be once you complete the shchita. But if Rav Huna would have just left out that, if he had left out that detail, if that wasn't part of his shita, well, then we would have just said, oh yeah, Rav Huna is saying that when you complete the shchita, it's going to be asur. And we would say that the brisa is also talking about when you complete the shchita, that's when you're chayav for being Michal Shabbos and for avodah zarah and for shchutei chutz. But it's the fact that Rav Huna had said that once you slice through one of the simanim, already it's asur. That's when we had this question from the brisa that, well, but then what about shchutei chutz? Right, again, Amar Papa says, Papa, ilav the Amar Rav Huna siman echad. If Rav Huna wouldn't have said anything about slicing through just one of the simanim and it's already asur, well, lo avya chatas tiyuvte. We wouldn't have had a question then from the brisa of the korban chatas, because my maisa rabbi would have just said, what is the maisa that Ula is talking about? What is the maisa that Rav Huna is talking about? A complete shchita, and then we wouldn't have any questions. V'amar Papa, and says Rav Papa, he loved the Amar Rav Huna behemas chavero, and if not for the fact that Rav Huna is talking about his friend's animal, well, lo avya chatas tiyuvte, well then also the chatas, which is keilu, it's somebody else's animal. So that wouldn't have been a question for Rav Huna if Rav Huna was talking about his own animal. So keilu, even if he said that we're talking, so even if Rav Huna would have said that we're talking about slicing through just one of the simanim, but it's his own animal, well then we would say, oh, okay, fine, it's his own animal, and the korban chatas is keilu, it's somebody else's animal, so it wouldn't have been a question. My time of diday matzi aser dechavilo matzi aser, because his own thing he could make aser by just slicing through one of the simanim, but not so his friends. But now that he says that slicing through just one of the simanim and it's talking about his friends, well then we have the question based on the chatos, which is also keilu, it's somebody else's. So pshita, this is obvious. Well, I may have thought Kevin de konile lechapara kedide damya. Well, I may have thought that since then at the end of the day we're talking about a korban chatos, and he's drying it, sure, he's not going to be able to eat any of it. And once it's slaughtered, the rest goes either on the Mizbeach or the Kohanim, not to him. But because he's the one getting the kapara, though, so maybe it should be considered like it's his. So Kamash Malan, they know it's not considered like it's his. And therefore, that's why it's analogous to specifically slicing through your friend, shechting your friend's animal. Friends, that was Daf Mem of Masechta Chullin. Daf Mem of Masechta Chullin was a kind of small daf, but packed with very, I don't know what the right word is, not quite intricate, but really some very, very subtle lines that we really had to kind of go line by line, even though there weren't that many lines, but we really had to work through line by line. But some beautiful things. Slaughtering for the mountains, right? We're talking about if you slaughter for the mountains or the rivers or whatever. So we said that if you're slaughtering for the actual mountains, so then it is merely pasul. If you're sacrificing for the mountain angel, for the angel of the mountains, well then it is a sacrifice of the dead. It's what's called zivchei mesim. And we saw an interesting discussion, Rashi and Tosfos, about why when slaughtering for the actual mountains, it is simply pasul. Rashi had said, well, because the actual mountains can't become avodah zarah, right? Al eharim Eloheim v'lo eharim Eloheim. That the actual mountain can't become avodah zarah, and that is why slaughtering for the actual mountains is not zivchei mesim, and it's just pasul because it's similar to slaughtering for avodah zarah. However, Tosfos pointed out, but then why are you chayiv misa? If it's not actually avodah zarah, why are you chayiv misa? So Tosfos gave two answers. One of them is that actually the mountain is avodah zarah, and that whole limud about the mountain not being avodah zarah is just except that you don't have to actually destroy it. But it is actually technically avodah zarah, one that you don't have to destroy, and that explains why slaughtering for it, you will be chayiv misa for. And then technically the animal, though, is not zivchei mesim, just like the kalim, the vessels used to worship the mountain, are not asur. And there was another answer, which is that actually the mountain is not avodah zarah, which explains why it is not zivchei mesim, but you nonetheless are chayiv misa, just like you'd be chayiv misa for worshiping the sun and the moon and the constellations. We then discussed slaughtering your friend's animal for avodah zarah. We saw the shita of Rav Huna that you are chayiv once you slice through one of the simanim. That was based on Ula's shita, that was aligned with Ula's shita as well. We then got into that whole brisa about, well, there's a korban chatas and you chayiv 3 times, and we asked all sorts of questions. There were some very subtle questions. I'm not going to get into them now, but ultimately we had a very nice discussion there based on that brisa. We really worked through it line by line, but ultimately Rav Huna's shita stands that you are chayiv once you slice through one of the simanim of your friend's animal. Friends, that was Daf Mem, Daf 40 of Masechta Chullin. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.